You're very kind. Thank you very much for the gracious introduction and also for all of you being here today. It's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with all of you today about a topic that I think is very important, and that is the role and value of government in American life. The question of the role of government, the size of government, and the cost of government is one that is now being hotly debated in the United States. In many ways, that debate is a partisan debate between Democrats and Republicans and even some libertarians and others of all different political backgrounds. But in other ways, that debate is one that is even more profound than just politics. And I think it's important against the backdrop of an unfolding presidential campaign in the United States to share a few thoughts about this important question of the value of government. And so today I would like to speak with you about four distinct topics that very much relate to that idea. The first is to share a few thoughts on contemporary American discourse on government, because I think we're seeing some really interesting things happening and frankly some concerning things happening in U.S. discourse about government. And I'd like to make a few observations about that. The second thing I'd like to speak about is the reality of the role of government in the lives of American citizens and in the life of our nation. Because I think that a lot of the rhetoric that we hear about government in the United States is rather disconnected from the reality of most Americans' experience with government in this country. Third, I'd like to talk a little bit about taxes. It makes little sense to talk about the role of government without talking about how we pay for government, and that is through taxes. And so I think to talk about the question of government, we have to bring in that financial side of the picture and make a few observations about that. Finally, I'll share a few concluding thoughts about the value of government and public service, and I think the need to change the way we in the United States talk about this topic. Before I get into my remarks in earnest, I'd like to just issue perhaps three disclaimers. Number one, the views that I'm expressing are my own and not anyone else's. They don't represent the views of the East-West Institute or any other entity or individual. They're my views informed by my experiences and informed by my values. And so I'd like to share those with you in a candid way. That said, they're also informed by a lot of reading that I've done, and I want to give particular credit to the writings of Professor Douglas J. Amy, who is a professor at Mount Holyoke College, and he has written extensively, and I think very compellingly, on why government is a force for good in American life. And my thinking has certainly been deeply influenced by many of his writings, and I want to acknowledge that intellectual debt that I owe to Professor Amy in these remarks. The second disclaimer, or caveat, is that I'll be speaking mostly about the question of federal government, because in my own experience, I've been most deeply involved in federal government. I worked for 18 years as a U.S. diplomat. I had the opportunity to serve the government and serve this country, which I regarded as a great privilege in my life. And so many of my remarks are really focused on federal government, but I think that they're broadly applicable to state and local government as well. And the third and final disclaimer that I would like to note at the outset is that this topic can be seen as rather sensitive in a political context because it very much is at the core of the debate in the United States between Democrats and Republicans. But I offer my thoughts today very much in a nonpartisan spirit because I think that the issues at issue in this discussion are more fundamental than merely partisan politics. So I want to look at the question of government and how we as a nation talk about government, not through a political prism, but rather at a more philosophical level. I don't advocate the election or defeat of any candidate or any party in my comments, and this is not a partisan talk. Thus far in my life, I haven't had occasion to give a partisan talk. And in this sense, I wanted to just note that I'm not saying anything today in a strictly partisan sense. But admittedly, and I want to acknowledge this as well, The majority of the criticism of government that we hear in American rhetoric today does in fact come from the Republican side of the aisle. It doesn't come exclusively from there, because Democrats in many cases, particularly conservative Democrats, often find much to criticize in the role and size of U.S. government as well. But I do acknowledge that there is a bit of a lopsidedness. But I'm not looking at this through a partisan prism, but rather on the merits of the issue itself. So with those introductory comments, let me just say a few words then to begin with about the discourse and the quality and caliber of discourse on the U.S. government, on government generally in the United States today. I think there's a basic debate in the United States, perhaps the central debate in American politics, on the size and role of government. And in practical terms, I think one way to look at American politics and to boil it down to its essence is to frame it in this way, that the central task of American public policy fundamentally is to find the equilibrium between the American people's desire for a certain level of government services and their willingness, on the other hand, to pay for those services. Finding that equilibrium fundamentally is what public policy is about. Public policy that is off equilibrium, that doesn't find that equilibrium, is not going to have enduring viability or political sustainability. And so finding that balance point against the myriad interests that we see playing out in this country is the core task of government and the core task of public policy. There can be legitimate debate as to where exactly that equilibrium lies. Does it lie here? Does it lie a little to the right, a little to the left, a little bit more in terms of federal expenditures, a little less? And there is and should be a lot of debate about those topics. That's the essence, in a sense, of the political debate and even the partisan debate in the United States. But one thing is very clear, and that is that the tone of the discussion about government in the United States has changed dramatically in the last several decades, and in particular in recent years. One could go back and talk about the run for president, the campaign for the presidency of Barry Goldwater in 1964, who was really the first major party figure to run on a fairly stern or severe anti-government message as the Republican candidate for president. And he was soundly defeated by LBJ by the largest popular vote margin in the history of U.S. presidential elections. But the ideas that he articulated nonetheless colored politics in the United States, and certainly Republican politics, but I would argue all politics going forward. And so in 1981, President Ronald Reagan stood on the steps of the Capitol and placed his hand on the Bible and delivered his inaugural address as a man who moments later would become President of the United States. And in his inaugural address, he said, "Government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem." Now, since then, this notion of basically government is bad has really taken root in the American polity, and not just on the Republican side. It's an idea that has become very popular. It certainly is popular amongst Republicans, but you hear it from Democrats as well. And the narrative that government is bad has essentially taken hold in the American psyche, and rhetoric, in fact, has become quite a bit more extreme around this issue. Yes, it's mostly a GOP phenomenon, but not exclusively. And today, we see it manifested most obviously in the statements that are made by the current batch of aspirants to the presidency, those who are running for the Republican nomination. The theme is basically one that perhaps I could put generously as that government which governs least governs best. But it's often put somewhat more crassly and harshly than that on the campaign trail. In broad terms, I think the basic message that we hear about government across the landscape of American political discourse is essentially that we tax too much, that we regulate too much, and that basically the United States government tries to do too much. And in broad terms, that is the argument that is put forward. And those statements and those suppositions and assertions flesh out the idea that government is bad. Because after all, if it were a force for good, we wouldn't be complaining about it doing too much. Most call on this side of the argument for drastic cuts in government, but offer virtually no specifics as to what those cuts might look like. My fellow Texan, who I've had the privilege to meet on one occasion, Congressman Ron Paul, who is a candidate for president, who is a Republican, but also really very much a libertarian, has said that if he were elected president, in his first year he would cut $1 trillion out of the United States federal budget of about $4 trillion. Now, when pressed for details on that, he hasn't offered many specifics. And when you think about it, recognizing that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and servicing the debt account for an enormous percentage in the great majority of federal spending, and add on to that defense spending, there's very little room to play with to get $1 trillion of cuts and to have a country that still looks something like the country that we know today, whether we like this or that particular program. To have a recognizable government and a recognizable America and $1 trillion of cuts in year one is a pretty tough thing to do. But the point that I would make here is it's an example of where the rhetoric has gone. And more generally, we see some rather surprising and I would argue somewhat incendiary language with respect to characterizing positions on the size of government and with respect to characterizing one's political opponents. And we do see it on both sides, as I often reiterate. But some of the words that we hear to describe, for example, President Obama and other political figures are terms like communist, socialist. In some cases, we've heard the term fascist. But these are rather striking terms for any American to use about another American, when in fact you think back on American history and realize that the United States and the American people spent many decades in a struggle, an epic struggle with communism, with state socialism in terms of the US-Soviet divide. And to use these kinds of terms to characterize American political opponents, however much you might disagree, is in fact a rather striking testament to just how extreme the political rhetoric around the role and size of government has really become. So what explains why rhetoric has gone so far in that direction? I think it's a number of different things. First and foremost, I think it's important to point out that in the United States there is in fact a very deep-seated tradition of distrust for government. This country, in fact, was founded on that distrust. The idea that those who came to the United States across the Atlantic Ocean were generally fleeing persecution and were generally trying to get to a place where the government didn't have the kind of invasive and intrusive role in their individual lives. And it was that mindset and it was that ethic that gave rise and gave expression to the United States of America. So the deep-seated distrust of government is one of the fundamental reasons that explain, one of the reasons that explain why rhetoric has gone that far. Another is that we're seeing today a great level of anxiety and also a great level, frankly, of anger on the part of many Americans across party lines in their economic circumstances and in the economic circumstances of our nation. There is a sense or a feeling of powerlessness that is very frustrating to many millions of our fellow citizens. And people are responding to that with a great level of anxiety, anger, frustration, and a sense that they want to do something about it. And this leads to another point. I think there is a sense, going back to that notion of powerless, that there are not a lot of things that Americans might feel they can do something about and fix and change in the immediate future. Most of us don't think we can go out on the streets or go anywhere and regulate the U.S. business cycle, or create more jobs tomorrow, or give myself a job if I'm unemployed. We don't feel that we can manipulate the levers of American economics and American society in such a way as to rectify the problems or the injustices that we might see. But there's one thing that we can do something about, and that is our government. We can go to the ballot booth, and we can cast a ballot for this candidate or for that candidate. And we can actually vote the bums out. And so we have a sense of being in power. We have a sense of an ability to have an impact on that particular slice of American life. We can't regulate the business cycle, we can't change the unemployment figures, but by golly, we can throw the rascals out of office. And so that sense of anxiety and that sense of anger coalesce around the one outlet that Americans feel they can do something about today, on Tuesday, on the day that we go to vote, whether it's for city council, state legislature, Congress, or the presidency. The simplicity of the argument that government is bad is another aspect of it that makes it compelling, or seemingly compelling, and attractive to many. All of us who have studied political science know that simpler arguments work better than more complex ones. If it can fit on a bumper sticker on the back of a car, it's got a better chance of being heard and understood than if it would take 210 bumper stickers to convey the message. And so simplicity is what drives a lot of political messaging. And the three-word idea that government is bad is about as simple as you can get. That government is the problem. That's a simple message. And so the simplicity of that message, and it's a message that resonates with perhaps that deep-seated distrust, perhaps a bias that's already there, that governments can't really operate effectively, or that our government specifically doesn't operate effectively or efficiently. It builds on itself and creates this notion that government is the problem and let's take government to task, and it gives rise to this heated rhetoric. In fact, what I would say is that what we're seeing in the United States today, more on one side than the other, but on both sides, is a kind of scapegoating of government that I believe is tearing away at the fabric of the American polity. Now, with that, let me say a few words about the role that government actually does play in our lives. Critics, as we've talked about, basically look at government and see virtually nothing of value in government for the American people, except perhaps the idea that the government in this country raises the greatest military that the world has ever known. But beyond that, there's a widespread sense of, I don't get the feeling government has done much for me lately. That's out there as a sentiment. Rush Limbaugh, the conservative radio celebrity and figure, put a challenge out some years ago to his radio audience and said, I challenge anyone to call in and name just one thing that the government has done for you of any value. And then answering his own rhetorical question, he said after a few seconds, see, I told you so. There is no answer to that question. And it's indicative of this notion and emblematic of this idea that government doesn't do anything of value. On the campaign trail, on the very day that he announced his candidacy for president, my governor, Rick Perry, stated in a speech that was a very good opening salvo in the race that he wanted to run for president because he sought to, quote, make government as inconsequential to your lives as possible. But the fact is, to the degree that government has been consequential to the lives of most Americans, it has been consequential in mostly a positive way. Abraham Lincoln said, the legitimate object of government is to do for the people what needs to be done, but which they cannot by individual effort do at all or do well for themselves. I would argue that broadly speaking, and certainly with some misfires along the way, that is exactly what the United States government has managed to accomplish over the last 200 plus years. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the myriad ways that government has had a positive impact on the lives of Americans and the life of our nation. But let me just give a few examples. And let me also note that Professor Douglas Amy of Mount Holyoke, to whom I owe a debt in my own thinking on this issue, has written very compellingly a piece, and for those who are interested I can provide the website, where he looks at an average American and chronicles the ways in which that average American on an average day interfaces with the government. And to give you an idea of it, and I won't belabor it here, but it's a very interesting discussion, he basically says when the alarm goes off next to your bed and you push the snooze button or the off button, you're interfacing with government starting from that moment, because you are dealing with an electrical item, the standards of which were set down by some level of government, by some form of regulation that makes sure that the currencies that are pulsing through those wires are safe for a household and that you're not going to be shocked or killed by some sort of electrical mishap. And starting at 6:19 a.m. or perhaps in some of our cases 9:04 a.m. or other hours, you start to interact with government in ways that you may not be fully cognizant of, but that are very real. And it's all the way through the day. But let me give you a few big picture pieces that are so obvious that perhaps they don't need to be stated, and yet in this day and age, with rhetoric being what it is, I think they deserve to be mentioned. These are some of the things that the government has done that I think are very positive for all of us. The government has regulated the business cycle so as to preclude, for the most part, a second Great Depression, the likes of which we had in the late 20s and early 30s. The government is a strong advocate for public health and has been a leading force in eliminating childhood diseases through immunization programs. The government has built the interstate highway system on which so many of us rely to get around and on which so much American commerce depends. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Social Security, and Medicare and Medicaid. The GI Bill, which gave rise to a substantial swath of the American middle class, and indeed modern America in some ways as we know it. Consumer protection, anti-discrimination, the military, which we've noted earlier, clean air, clean water, and the list goes on. It could literally be hundreds of distinct or thousands of distinct items that one could cite. And you don't hear a lot of talk about those things on the campaign trail, but those are very real. And that's the reality of the role that government, in fact, plays in our lives on a day-to-day basis. But there are also intangible things that government does for its people and that the U.S. government does for the American people that don't come through the stat sheets and that aren't quantifiable or measurable in any statistical way. Governments can provide something that the private sector generally doesn't provide: justice, equality, fairness, security. When one of us is wronged, a crime is committed, we go to government, not the private sector, to seek redress for that wrong. When we are on the streets of New York or Austin, Texas, or any city in this country, we rely on government entities to account for our security on a micro level, at a street level. It's governments that ensure that streets are generally safe to walk on, or that if something happens, something will be done about it. Equality. The private sector historically hasn't been very good about providing equality to the American people. And in fact, the government hasn't always been very good at it either. But the government learned along the way through the wisdom of the American people, and we've seen a march toward equality in this country that is laudable. And I think that if you look at those abstract ideas, you see that there are things that the U.S. government has done that could not have been done and that weren't done by the private sector. As I said in Houston when I gave a version of this talk there as a keynote address for an event that was honoring public service in the city of Houston, I said it was the government and not the private sector that ended slavery in this country. So there's an even deeper level that we can talk about when we talk about the value of government. And that goes to the question of rights and freedoms. The general narrative that we hear in the United States is that there is an antithesis between the notion of government on the one hand and, quote, my rights on the other. And that is to say, the issue is framed generally as the more government is involved, the less room I have to exercise my rights as an American citizen. When you think about that, it's almost as if the notion of rights exists as an abstraction that doesn't require any action or any effort to enforce. Now, make no mistake, the government in this country didn't give us our rights. I believe, like most Americans believe, that our rights are a gift from our Creator, and that we have certain inalienable rights endowed to us by our Creator. But here on earth, it is the government that has to be empowered to defend and enforce those rights. And so here I'd like to cite the writings of two scholars who are cited in Professor Amy, but who have written a book on this topic. And the scholars are Stephen Holmes and Cass Sunstein. And they've written a book called The Costs of Rights: Why Liberty Depends on Taxes. In their book, they make three statements that I want to highlight here that talks about the notion of rights as constructs that essentially governments are called upon to enforce. The first sentence, and I'm quoting directly here, all rights are claims to an affirmative government response. Everything we think of as a right is a claim on the government to do something. That's what a right is. A right is something that is due you, something to which you are entitled. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. We're entitled to certain things: free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, and the list goes on. But to exercise those rights, we have to be able to call on the government to do something when someone infringes on those rights or threatens to infringe on those rights. So if someone punches me in the jaw on the street or denies me the opportunity to speak out freely, who do I go to deal with that? And the answer is the government. The second statement I would highlight is, as they state, it is implausible to be for rights and against government. It is implausible to be for rights and against government. And that's precisely because the notion of a right is not a mere abstraction. It requires someone doing something to make sure you've got it, to make sure that your God-given right is respected. And again, that is government. And thirdly, again quoting from Holmes and Sunstein, rights are imposed by the government and they are funded by the public. How many of us think of rights being funded? We at a think tank here often talk about, is our program funded or not? But how many of us think about, my right to free speech is funded in this amount by this entity? Well, guess what? It is funded. It's funded by you and by me. It's funded by the American people spending taxes to create the mechanisms in this country that make it possible for me to exercise that free right, and for you to exercise that free right as well. So, or that right freely. And so we have to think differently about what we mean by rights. But the notion that somehow there is an inherent antithesis between government on the one hand and my rights on the other is a fundamental misconstruction of the idea of what rights are. And I think when we realize that, we start to talk about and think about government differently. In fact, according to our Constitution, to protect and enforce our rights is the very reason that government was created in the first place. And that's something that those who talk about how bad government is, whatever party they're from, that is a point that they miss. Now, this may seem self-evident, but why do so many of us in America fail to see how positively consequential the government is in our lives, if all of these things that I've said and that other scholars have said and I've quoted are true? I think there are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, the nature of the benefits that all of us receive from government is such that they are generally, those benefits are intangible. They're not something that we necessarily see on a daily basis. They're often long-term, and in many cases, they are negative assurances, if I can borrow a term from the security world. That is to say, in many cases, we're paying our government to make sure that things don't happen. And we don't always then remember that we are blessed that those things didn't happen. So if I'm in a car and I'm in an automobile accident, and thanks to the design standards that were imposed and regulated by the government, that car sustains the wreck and I come out with only minor injuries or no injuries because there were regulations in place regarding seat belts or other things. I have benefited by something not happening to me that might have happened or would have happened had the government not played that particular role. Same for a drug that I might take that is safer because the FDA put it through the ringer and made sure that it was safe to take. And it's not that there are never misfires or mistakes, but on the whole, these are things that don't happen to me and don't happen to you that are a function of money that all of us have spent in terms of our tax dollars. So the intangibility, the fact that these are not things that we think about and see every day is a reason that people often don't realize the role that government plays in our lives. At the same time, I think many of us take a lot of things for granted. And so we don't necessarily think about it that much. Some things that we get from our government in this country are so deeply ingrained in our psyche, in our sense of what we are entitled to, in the fabric of our national life, that we don't even think about them anymore. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid would be three enormous programs that I would put in that category. There isn't a real debate in America as to whether there ought to be Social Security. No one really debates that within the mainstream of either party. There are talks about, do we need to cut benefits? What do we need to do to make Social Security solvent? Is there a role for the private sector and individual investing? But everyone says, hey, Social Security is there. It's been there for many decades. But we often forget about it because it's been there, we think that it's going to be there, and we view it as an entitlement. There's a story that Professor Amy notes where a U.S. congressman goes back to his district and basically has a town hall meeting talking about all kinds of domestic political issues with his constituents. And when talking about Medicare, one of the constituents stood up and said, I'm a senior citizen, I'm one of your constituents, and let me tell you, Congressman, I want you to keep your government hands off of my Medicare. Almost as if he didn't realize that Medicare was a creation of the government that the American people elected at that time. And so these things become so deeply ingrained that we don't see them. Those are some of the reasons that I think we tend to err on the side of sort of falling into that trap of the easy answer, the simplistic answer that somehow government is bad, because we don't think carefully. We don't take a few minutes to really realize what we have in terms of the government that we ourselves have elected in accordance with our constitutional principles. Let me talk a little bit about taxes before coming to the conclusion. I mentioned at the outset that it's difficult to talk about the United States government or any government if you don't talk about how that government is funded. And governments are funded by taxes. The very word taxes, however, is highly charged and fraught with negative connotations. It appears in sayings, for example, that the only two things you can't avoid in American life are death and taxes. And that gives you a sense for how we, the American people, generally construe taxes. And yet it's impossible to talk about government without talking about that question as well. Oliver Wendell Holmes said that taxes are, quote, the price we pay for civilization. Franklin Roosevelt said that taxes are, quote, the admission we pay to enter organized society. But relatively few American political figures refer to taxes that way on the stump from either party. Instead, they put forward the idea that taxes are something that they, in Washington or in Albany, impose on us. It's somehow as if there were no connection between the American people and American taxpayers on the one hand, and the government that we have freely elected in accordance with our own Constitution on the other. And thus we hear phrases like, get the government off our backs, get the government out of our pockets. We need, quote, tax relief, as if it was a burden imposed on us against our will by people other than our duly elected representatives in the United States government. This is the language of alienation and disconnect between a people and its elected representatives. And this is a language that is very corrosive to the fabric of the American polity. This type of language does our nation a disservice because it perpetuates a sense that there is a disconnect between our people on the one hand and our own elected officials. And it perpetuates the fallacy that taxes are somehow not organic to our experience as Americans and to our polity, rather that there's some kind of evil and that they are artificial to our natural existence as citizens of a nation, and rather than the necessary cost of doing business as a citizen of this country. Now, my view is that taxes are not inherently bad. Rather, their value can only be defined by what we're getting for those taxes. At the federal level, the only view that really matters is the view of our entire citizenry as a whole, as expressed through our duly elected representatives. In this sense, I have long held that in a democracy there is no inherently right answer to the question, what is the best size of government? In my view, and as I have said before, but I think it bears reiterating, the size of the United States government is right when the American people are happy with what they're getting for what they're paying. That's the right size of government. Any discussion about the right size of government that is independent of the judgment of the American people strikes me as being rather presumptuous and rather arrogant, because it is for the American people to say what size of government, and to say collectively what size of government they want. So the trick is to have a size of government that the American people want at a price that the American people are willing to pay. And if you've achieved that, then you have achieved the right size of government. Now, I call this a value approach to the size of government. I don't take the view that there is a right answer, that government should be big or that government should be small. Because I think that ignores two things: the will of the American people, and number two, the notion that what we're talking about is a value proposition. If someone says, I bought a car this weekend for $25,000, you say, wow, that seems like a lot of money. They say, well, but I got a Lamborghini for it. Somebody just had to unload it and I paid $25,000, I got a Lamborghini. You got a great deal. Same person says, I paid $25,000 and got a 1974 Pinto. They didn't do so well. So it's not how much money you're spending, it's what you're getting for the money you're spending. That whole discussion has been absent in American political discourse. So I advocate, again, a value approach to the size of government. One can debate whether the American people are happy with what they're getting today. Some might say the American people are. Some, perhaps in the Occupy Wall Street movement and in many other corners of America, might say we're not happy. For that matter, the Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party, both sides of the aisle, you'll have people that say the American people are not happy with what they're getting. That is a topic for legitimate debate. It is a topic that can be contested in elections. What is not debatable is that we are not paying for what we're getting. And that's why this nation has a $15 trillion national debt. And a year from now, if we were to assemble in this room, or even if we don't, we'll have a $16 trillion debt. Because we're getting a certain level of service, but we as a people are not willing to pony up the money to pay for what we're getting. And that's a problem. It's a bipartisan problem. Both parties had a hand in creating that problem. Neither party owns the lion's share. And in the final analysis, I would even go further. In the final analysis, I think it's the American people who ultimately have failed in this regard. We have not been willing to pay for what we expect from our government. And our representatives haven't, I think, been very effective in leading in this regard as well. Now, one could make many points about this particular line of argument, but the point that I'd like to make here is until we change how we think and talk about taxes, we are unlikely to get to a sustainable equilibrium. The equilibrium that I talked about at the outset, which is fulfilling the American people's desire for a certain size of government at a price that the American people are willing to pay. The central tenet, the central task of U.S. public policy is that. And we won't get there if we keep demonizing the idea that taxes are some sort of evil imposed by them on us. Let me conclude with a couple of thoughts about what we can and perhaps should do to change the tone of our discussions in this country and the tone of our discourse on government. There is a rhetorical war on government in the United States today. It comes from both sides of the aisle. I talked earlier about this notion that government is bad. But these are not just words. These words actually have an impact on the tone and the substance of U.S. public policy and the quality of our national life. This rhetoric, this rhetorical war on government, this scapegoating of government, contributes to a self-perpetuating negative cycle that makes it more and more difficult for us to achieve that objective of public policy, which is finding the equilibrium. When taxes are inherently evil, it's very difficult to make the case that we need to raise a certain amount of taxes to provide what the American people demand and expect. An example of this is the case of Fema from a few years ago. Over the years, Fema had come under attack as being not a particularly efficient or effective U.S. government agency, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And its budget was cut, it was shrunk, it became less capable of doing the kind of things that it was called upon to do. And then Katrina hit New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, and we had the worst hurricane event in modern American history. Fema didn't do a particularly good job, both Democrats and Republicans would acknowledge, in responding to that catastrophic event. There were a number of reasons for that, but some scholars have looked at this and noted one of the reasons was it had been underfunded and starved of the resources that it might have then used in these circumstances had it been given those resources to do a better job of responding to Hurricane Katrina. As a result, however, of its poor performance, people said, see, the government botched the response to the most significant hurricane that we've had in this country. And as a result, we need to scrap FEMA because just as we were saying and postulating all along, it couldn't do the job. And then that creates additional pressures for cuts, which creates lower levels of performance, which create additional pressures, and the cycle perpetuates. That's a good example, one of a number that could be cited that go to the question of this self-perpetuating negative cycle that we get into when the rhetoric becomes as heated as it has. How do we change that? Not easily, but here are a couple of ideas that I would throw out to think about. First of all, I think that all of us as citizens have an obligation to, or in any case, it's certainly in our interests, to start speaking about government differently in our own conversations. And to recognize that when you use loaded terminology about government, you start to create the mindset in this country, or at least you contribute to and are complicit in creating the mindset in this country that leads to the kind of negative cycles that we've talked about. So I think using a different language, talking about and elevating the idea of government as our government and public service as service to our country are very important ideas. I think we also have to challenge and correct inaccuracies that we encounter as we're dealing with people. I gave a talk on foreign policy not long ago on U.S.-China relations, and someone in the audience stood up and said, "David, I have a question. How do you explain why the United States would give many hundreds of billions of dollars to China in aid, in development assistance?" Now, our entire government budget is $4 trillion. And historically, it's been closer to $3 trillion. And this individual was saying that they were postulating that we're giving hundreds of billions of dollars to China as aid. I had to point out that the premise of the question was incorrect. We don't give any aid to China. We work with China on a lot of issues, but for any number of reasons we don't give aid, not least because ideologically the Chinese won't and can't accept it, and for other reasons as well. But the premise of the question was inaccurate, and we all have an obligation as professionals in the world of foreign affairs and as American citizens and people who care about the future of this country to correct those kinds of erroneous premises so that we can get the discussion back on the merits of the actual case. I think we also have to find a new way to frame and talk about government. Professor Amy and others have come up with certain words that might be a better way of talking about government, rather than sort of the tax man and the idea that the government has got its hands in my pocket. Maybe it's better to talk about government as watchdog, government as defender of those in our country who are in greatest need of being defended, government as protector, government as consensus builder, government as administrator of programs that are popular with the American people. But in any case, we've got to find a vocabulary that better captures the reality of what government does for our people. Because by changing the language, we can start to change the mindset. One further point before I come to my concluding comments, and that is, I've thought that it might be valuable to have some kind of what I would term a truth in labeling campaign in this country. And that is to say, when we go to the store and buy some food, we see how many calories and how much trans fat, sugar, and so on. One of the problems, as we noted earlier, that we have in this country in terms of understanding the role that government plays in our lives is that we don't see it. So what if you went and were buying a Mazda Miata or a car at the dealer, and it had a sticker that said, if you earned this much last year, 42 of your tax dollars went to making sure that this car will not explode if it's hit a certain way. Let's just say that that's the figure. And the consumer might say, you know what, I paid $4,000 or $27,000 or $100,000 or whatever number of dollars in taxes last year. And I'm glad that $42 of that went to making sure this car is safe for me and for my children. That was a good investment. And when you start talking in real terms about what it is that our government tax dollars, our tax dollars do, and label that, although it may sound impractical and it may sound even a little gimmicky, but it gets at a larger truth. And that is that when we start to realize where the tax dollars, or in many cases the tax pennies, went on a per capita basis, we start to see the connection between what we have voluntarily given our government and what the government is giving in return to the people. So that's something that I think is worth looking at. You know, Professor Amy mentioned an example or some statistical information that I think is worth thinking about. He said that the average American citizen gets about $10,000 worth of services from the government every year. The average American citizen. About $10,000 worth of goods or services if one were to try to put a commercial value on some of these things. That if you were to then count intangibles like maybe equality, justice, and so on, that number would rise to 16,000. And if you were to count federal, state, and local levels of government altogether, the average American citizen gets about $27,000 worth of good stuff from the government, whether goods or services or intangible processes, in the course of a year. To put that in perspective, since I'm a big proponent of the idea of value, meaning you've got to compare one figure to what you're getting, well, and also you've got to compare these figures to sort of what the American people are paying in taxes. The overwhelming majority of the American people don't pay $27,000 a year in taxes. Quite a few do pay a lot more than that. But on average, the average American person and the average American middle class individual is making money on the deal. And that's something to think about. One can look at the methodology and get into a discussion with Professor Amy or others as to the validity of those figures, but it at least starts to quantify the issue so that we have some baseline to talk about what are we giving and what are we getting. Now, it won't be easy to change the calcified narrative that government is the problem. And in fact, that it's more often the solution than the problem. But that's what is required if we are to restore the health of our national treasury, and I would argue the health of our democracy. Let me offer a few concluding thoughts to wrap up. My views on the value of government are certainly very much informed by a number of things. They were informed by my parents, who very much instilled in me the idea that it's important to give back and it's important to serve. They were informed by a great professor that I had the privilege of studying with at the LBJ School in Austin, Texas, Professor Barbara Jordan, with whom I studied public ethics. And she taught, as my parents did, that public service is a noble and honorable calling, and that the work of our government is truly the work of our nation. So for me, public service in government is personal, and for me, my journey into government and in government was a function of my desire to be connected to a cause and an undertaking bigger than myself. Now, I'm proud of that record, and I'm proud of all of and grateful for the contributions of all of us who serve in different ways at different levels. I think all of us benefit from that service, and I salute it. Government is not bad. Government is good. And in that spirit, in the spirit of that statement, I ask that all of us commit to doing what we can to restoring confidence and faith in our government at all levels, to making government truly consequential in the most positive sense, and in the process to deepening our sense of national purpose and our sense of national community. Thank you.